bases, if any bases, honestly. There are some people that say we don't need any bases at all to, and in fact, if we eliminated our bases, the military would be, quite a bit more efficient. All right, second part of history, and this is, in my opinion, one of the most important parts of the topic, and you do need to write this down. It's something called the Global Defense Posture Review. Global Defense Posture Review, or GDPR for short. The last major reduction in U.S. military presence occurred in 2004. It was from an action called the Global Defense Posture Review, which was basically a study conducted by the Department of Defense where they said a lot of the reason why we have massive troop concentrations in lots of countries across the world is because of Cold War military requirements that no longer apply in today's world, so therefore we can afford to pull out a lot of troops from these bases. So the effect of that particular review was to reduce military presence by 70,000 troops across the world, including 30,000 troops from South Korea, which are no longer there because they some of them went to Iraq, and the majority of them went back to the continental United States. It also did a couple of other things. It called for investing in the expeditionary capabilities of the U.S. military. And expeditionary just means the military is agile. It doesn't require big bases to sustain it. It requires things like aerial refueling and transport planes and transport ships that can make the military fast and give it global reach. It doesn't require big bases. And as part of this, it established 3 types of military bases that the U.S. currently has. Number 1 is something called main operating bases. These are bases with permanent personnel. They have strong infrastructure. They support military families. They're huge. They're expensive. Korea and Japan are the best examples of these. I actually lived on a Japanese naval base for 2 years when I was in junior high. It was a huge effort. They've got golf courses and movie theaters and bowling alleys and all kinds of stuff because they support the whole family. They have schools. They've got, and in addition to all the military stuff that they normally do. Second, something called forward operating sites. Forward operating sites. These are small, expandable facilities that have extremely limited military personnel. They are mostly about pre-positioned equipment or logistics operations. So these are, they might only have a handful of military personnel at a particular base. They probably don't have the infrastructure to support a family. They definitely don't have things like golf courses. The best example of this are our bases in Turkey, which are very, very small, and we only use them for logistics operations. But having said that, we also have tons of bases in South Korea and Japan that are just forward operating bases. Third are cooperative security locations. And this is something that is sometimes in the literature referred to lily pads. Because the idea is you hop onto a lily pad and then you hop off like a frog. So the military, if it needs to go to a particular place, it'll just move its military there, they'll be there for a second, and then they'll hop off into whatever country they're invading. A cooperative security location has almost no U.S. military personnel at it. It might have 5, for example, or it might have none. It might only be run by private contractors, or it might be run by the host nation. So we have we have these all over the world. And in fact, when I give you the shockingly high base totals that we have, a lot of these are cooperative security locations. And we can essentially maintain these bases without any military presence at all. We could eliminate our military presence to South Korea and Japan, and we could still maintain cooperative security locations because all it requires is an agreement by South Korea and Japan to agree that they will run these facilities if and when they are ever engaged in a conflict. The U.S. will hop in onto the lily pad base and then attack whoever was messing with South Korea or Japan. And we've got these all over the world, but I don't know of any in Turkey because for whatever reason I had difficulty finding quality articles on Turkey. But the rest of the topic countries, we have these in all of them. And Catherine Lutz actually makes kind of a counterintuitive argument regarding these, which is not necessarily a very good argument for topicality, but she says that the reduction in troops actually expanded U.S. military presence. That when the U.S. withdrew those 70,000 troops as part of the Global Defense Posture Review, we actually increased our ability to control the world. And she's a professor from Brown, so she's like a total hippie and is like, oh my gosh, the U.S. militarism and hegemony are bad things. So she's like, the U.S. is more positioned today than it ever has been, despite the fact it has lower numbers of deployments in the world, that its overall military presence is much higher. All right, it also did, this Global Defense Posture Review did 3 additional things. It expanded legal arrangements allowing greater U.S. military deployments in the future. So even short of cooperative security locations, with some countries it just provided a political agreement that if they're ever invaded, they will allow the U.S. to come in. Or even if the U.S. needs them for like the war on terrorism, they will allow the U.S. to come in. It greatly expanded the amount of pre-positioned equipment at cooperative security locations throughout the world. And it substantially expanded the training of host nation military forces. So Lutz uses the figure. She says the U.S. trains 100,000 foreign troops in 180 countries across the world every year globally, which to me seems a bit high, but more conservative estimates also say it is like 100 countries globally. Why do we do this? It's because we don't want to get involved in future Iraqs. We want other countries to do our dirty work for us. We want to provide things like air support. We want to provide naval support. But if it actually involves like heavy ground troop fighting or counterinsurgency, which the U.S. military doesn't do very well, then we want other nations to be able to take up a lot of that burden for us. So that's part of her argument about why it actually expanded U.S. military presence, because even though we reduced bases, we expanded training, and we expanded pre-positioned equipment, and we expanded cooperative security locations all over the globe. All right, implications of the Global Defense Posture Review. Number 1, reducing presence may not actually reduce military capability or power projection. And in fact, probably won't. And this, in my opinion, is kind of a damning argument for critical affirmatives, is that a lot of affirmatives, especially a lot of the Iraq and Afghanistan literature, are all written by the peace movement. They're like, we need to immediately withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan, we need to stop U.S. militarism, we need to stop future wars, etc. And the reality is, just withdrawing from those countries, or even withdrawing from all 6 of the topic countries, doesn't really do very much for undermining U.S. military capability globally. We have a very strong ability to intervene anywhere we want, and arguably, withdrawing our forces from Afghanistan and Iraq primes them to intervene in the next place, like Iran. So, in my opinion, even though I think that critical affirmatives will be very popular, I think there will be a lot of teams that advocate it just because the solvency evidence for these affirmatives is pretty good. The reality is they probably don't do a whole lot to actually undermine overall U.S. military power. Implication number 2 of the GDPR. Another GDPR is coming this year.